I came to see my friend, but every time I looked, it wasn't him. I couldn't stop noticing. The afternoon sun spilled lazily across the quiet suburban street as I parked my car in front of my friend's house. The familiar excitement of catching up with him mingled with a faint sense of unease I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just about the weekend gathering. Something in the air, in the quiet rhythm of this place, felt different. As I approached the door, laughter floated from inside, soft and warm, carrying the casual ease of people who had known each other for years. My friend opened the door, his familiar grin easing some of the tension I didn't know I'd been holding. But before I could step fully inside, a new presence drew my attention. She was there, my friend's mom, and even before she spoke, I noticed her. She moved with a quiet confidence, every gesture deliberate yet effortless. Her age, gracefully settled in her early 40s, carried a kind of calm authority that made her stand out without demanding attention. Her hair, streaked with soft hints of silver, framed her face in gentle waves. There was a warmth in her eyes, something behind the poised exterior that hinted at quiet depths and hidden stories. Our eyes met for the first time, and I felt a peculiar jolt, as if time had slowed for a heartbeat. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition, a strange, unspoken understanding. She smiled politely, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade, leaving only the gentle gravity of her presence. I forced myself to take a step forward, reminding myself why I was here, yet the pull of that gaze lingered far longer than it should have. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft, warm, with a note of curiosity I couldn't place. I shook her hand, noticing how her grip was firm but gentle, and how her fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary, sending a subtle warmth through me. There was a quiet steadiness in the way she held herself, a poised elegance that made my own nervousness seem clumsy in comparison. As we moved into the living room, I couldn't help but notice the small details. The way her hand rested lightly on the back of a chair, the way she tilted her head slightly when listening, the faint perfume she wore, floral, understated, lingering just long enough to catch my attention. Even as conversation flowed around us, my eyes kept returning to her, to the ease with which she commanded space without ever needing to demand it. Every small movement, a brush of her hand against the counter as she poured a drink, a casual laugh that lit up her face, carried an intimacy I wasn't sure I was meant to feel. It was disarming, this quiet magnetic pull between us, subtle yet impossible to ignore. I reminded myself she was my friend's mother, that I had no business being captivated in this way, and yet the awareness of her presence, the softness in her gaze, lingered with a quiet insistence. By the time my friend called my attention for a shared joke, I realized I was only half listening. My thoughts were already tangled in curiosity, admiration, and something deeper, a silent acknowledgement that this weekend might be about more than just catching up with an old friend. It was the beginning of a tension I couldn't yet name, a slow, simmering awareness that would quietly shape every moment to come. The afternoon drifted into early evening, and the gathering became a comfortable hum of voices, laughter, and the soft clinking of dishes. I found myself moving through the room, trying to engage with everyone, yet repeatedly my attention was drawn back to her. She was in the corner, arranging snacks on the counter, a graceful figure in the fading light. The way she moved, deliberate yet effortless, made even the simplest actions seem significant. At some point, our eyes met again. This time, it wasn't a fleeting glance. It was intentional, a quiet acknowledgement that she had noticed me noticing her. I approached, at first with the pretense of helping, but soon it became clear that neither of us was entirely focused on the task at hand. Our conversation began naturally, unforced, as if the room around us had softened, fading into the background. She spoke thoughtfully, her voice steady and calm, carrying warmth and subtle humor. There was a rhythm to her words, a gentle cadence that invited trust. She shared a light story about her day, something mundane about groceries or a small domestic mishap, but there was an undertone of vulnerability, a glimpse of the person behind the poised exterior. I listened, captivated not by the story itself, but by the way she spoke. Her eyes flickering with amusement, the way her lips curved when she smiled, and the quiet strength in her posture even as she revealed small imperfections. I felt an unfamiliar nervousness, a mix of admiration and hesitation. Every subtle gesture she made, the way her hand brushed lightly against the edge of the counter, the way she leaned slightly closer when emphasizing a point, seemed charged with meaning. I found myself mirroring her movements unconsciously, leaning in, listening more intently, drawn not only to her words but to her presence. And yet, there was a conflict inside me. I reminded myself constantly that I was here for my friend, that my curiosity and attention were meant to be limited, yet the pull toward her was undeniable. There was something in the way she observed me, calm, almost calculating, yet with an undeniable warmth, that made it impossible to look away. At one point, our hands brushed while reaching for the same snack, a fleeting contact that sent a subtle thrill up my arm. Neither of us flinched. Instead, there was a shared awareness, a silent acknowledgement of the small intimacy between us. My mind, usually so precise, felt like it had lost its footing, caught in the gravity of her presence. The conversation lingered, filled with comfortable pauses where words weren't necessary. We smiled, shared knowing looks, and for moments that stretched longer than they should, it felt like the rest of the world had melted away. I realized that my attention was no longer just curiosity. It was admiration, respect, and something more complex, something quietly magnetic. As the evening wore on, I left that conversation with a sense of lingering tension, a quiet thrill of awareness that there was an unspoken connection forming. I didn't know what it meant yet, only that every glance, every small touch, and every pause carried the promise of something deeper. And though the night was just beginning, I knew this was the first step in a slow, compelling journey I hadn't expected, but couldn't resist. The evening had settled into a comfortable rhythm, laughter bouncing off the walls, the hum of casual conversation filling the room. Everyone seemed caught up in their own worlds, yet for some reason, I kept finding my gaze drifting toward her. She moved through the room with effortless grace, arranging glasses on the counter, offering light jokes to those passing by. Her presence was magnetic, though it had never been overtly provocative, just the quiet pull of someone entirely self-assured and present in her own skin. It was during a casual game my friend had insisted we play that the moment arrived. The group had gathered in the living room, laughter and friendly competition filling the air. I was distracted, fumbling with my cards, when I noticed her watching me from the corner of the room. Her eyes held something, amusement, curiosity, a subtle mischief that made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't immediately place. Then she spoke, lightly, almost teasing, her voice carrying over the laughter. "You came for him, but you keep looking at me." The words landed with a jolt. My hand froze mid-motion, and I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. It was playful, certainly, yet underneath that teasing tone was a layer of meaning I couldn't ignore. It was as though she had seen right through the polite facade I had been trying so hard to maintain. I tried to respond with a casual shrug, a laugh that sounded far too nervous even to my own ears. I'm just distracted, I guess," I mumbled, though the statement felt meaningless. The teasing lilt in her voice, combined with the way her lips curved in that almost imperceptible smile, made it clear that she knew exactly what she was doing. She was testing me, nudging at the invisible line that separated propriety from curiosity. Even as my mind scrambled to reassert control, I found myself noticing every subtle detail. The way her hair caught the light as she tilted her head, the gentle rise and fall of her chest beneath the soft fabric of her blouse, the slight brush of her fingers against the edge of the table as she leaned in slightly. Each gesture carried an intimacy that wasn't overt but undeniable. The playful comment lingered in the air, unspoken words wrapped in humor and quiet tension. I felt an odd mixture of embarrassment and exhilaration, as though a door had been cracked open to a part of the evening I hadn't expected, and yet, somehow, had been hoping for. For a moment, our eyes met, and there was a shared acknowledgement of the unspoken. It wasn't about crossing boundaries. It was about the thrill of noticing, of being noticed, and the subtle electricity that sparked when two people who shouldn't yet be intertwined recognized each other's presence in a way deeper than mere casual conversation. I returned to the game, my focus only half on the cards in front of me. My thoughts lingered on her, on the gentle weight of her words, and the unexpected pull of attention she commanded so effortlessly. That night, I realized that this wasn't a fleeting distraction. There was something here, a quiet, slow-burning tension that neither of us could entirely ignore, and it had just begun. As the evening stretched on, the room buzzed with conversation, music, and laughter, yet somehow, the noise seemed to fade whenever I was near her. It was strange how silence could feel so loud, how the absence of words could carry more weight than any sentence exchanged. I found myself drawn to the kitchen, ostensibly to refill my drink, but also to steal another moment of proximity. She was there, naturally leaning against the counter, hands wrapped loosely around a mug, eyes gazing somewhere beyond the room. "Long night," she murmured softly, almost to herself, but I caught the sound and stepped closer. She glanced up, a gentle smile touching her lips. No one else noticed the exchange, and it felt like we had slipped into our own private world, one of quiet observation and unspoken understanding. We didn't need words to communicate. I leaned slightly against the counter, careful to maintain a respectful distance, yet close enough to feel the subtle warmth radiating from her. She adjusted her stance, and our shoulders brushed lightly, a fleeting contact that lingered in my awareness far longer than it should have. I could feel the subtle pulse of energy in that tiny connection, the quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence. There was a rhythm to this silence, almost conversational in its own way. She sipped her tea, eyes closing briefly as if savoring the warmth, and I noticed the delicate lines of her expression, the way her eyebrows lifted slightly with thought. The faint scent of her perfume, soft and floral, mingled with the steam rising from the cup, and it became impossible not to notice the gravity she carried without even trying. At one point, our hands brushed again as we reached for the same object, a napkin, a utensil, a dish, and neither of us recoiled. Instead, the contact felt natural, reassuring, a small acknowledgement that the tension simmering between us was mutual, quiet, and unforced. Every subtle gesture seemed laden with meaning. The slight turn of her head toward me, the way her gaze lingered before drifting away, the soft exhale that somehow carried a world of unspoken thought. I realized, with a mixture of excitement and hesitation, that these moments, brief, silent, seemingly insignificant, were where our connection deepened the most. Words in that instant would have been unnecessary, even intrusive. It was in the shared pauses, the quiet alignment of energy, that I began to understand her presence not just as someone captivating, but as someone profoundly affecting. When the laughter from the living room rose again, neither of us moved immediately. We remained in that pocket of quiet, shoulders still lightly touching, hearts quietly aware of the other's nearness. The tension was no longer just curiosity. It was recognition, a subtle, unspoken desire to linger together, to exist in this moment where the world outside the kitchen might as well have ceased to exist. As I eventually stepped back to rejoin the others, I carried with me a lingering awareness of her, an imprint of quiet intimacy that no words could capture. For the first time, I realized the pull I felt was not fleeting. It was deliberate, patient, and patient like her, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself fully. This silence was not emptiness. It was a bridge, a slow, powerful connection that neither of us yet dared to name. The room had quieted down after the laughter and chatter of earlier hours. Most guests had wandered off to other corners, leaving only the soft hum of background music and the occasional clink of glasses. I found her sitting on the edge of a chair near the window, the last rays of sunlight streaming through the glass and casting a warm glow around her. She seemed smaller somehow, not in presence, but in the way she held herself, open yet guarded, poised yet vulnerable. I approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Mind if I sit?" I asked quietly, and she shook her head with a faint smile. The space between us was close, yet unassuming, a comfortable intimacy that didn't demand anything but attention. For a while, we didn't speak. She gazed out the window, watching the leaves stir in the evening breeze, and I found myself watching her. The gentle rise and fall of her shoulders, the way her fingers traced patterns on her lap, the quiet way her eyes seemed to hold countless unspoken thoughts. It was mesmerizing. In this quiet, I realized that she was allowing herself to be seen, just a little, and that alone was a gift. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. People often see only the surface, the laugh, the smile, but not the things underneath. Her tone was almost confessional, tinged with weariness and honesty. I nodded, encouraging her without interrupting. "I've made mistakes," she continued, eyes meeting mine briefly before flicking away, "and I've learned to hide pieces of myself from everyone because it's safer that way." There was no self-pity, only quiet strength, and the barest vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I felt an urge to reach out, to bridge the gap between her cautious openness and the trust she had extended. I feel drawn to you," I said, my voice low, careful. "I don't know if it's the way you move, the way you talk, or everything about you. But I notice you. More than I should, maybe." The words left my mouth almost before I realized I'd said them, but I didn't retract them. There was honesty in admitting it, and in this moment, that honesty mattered more than caution. She looked at me, then really looked, and for a heartbeat I thought she might withdraw. But she didn't. Instead, her eyes softened, revealing a flicker of recognition, an acknowledgement that she had felt the same tension, the same unspoken pull. "I've noticed it too," she whispered, almost as if afraid to admit aloud. "More than I probably should." There was a pause, a fragile moment where time seemed suspended. Our hands brushed lightly, almost by accident, but neither moved away. I felt the warmth of her skin, the subtle pressure of her fingers against mine, and the quiet steadiness of her presence. It was electric in its simplicity, not a rush of passion, but a slow, grounding connection that promised understanding, care, and something more profound than fleeting attraction. That night, I realized that our connection was no longer a subtle curiosity or playful tension. It had become deliberate, conscious, and mutual. And as she allowed herself to be seen, even just a little, I felt the slow bloom of something that would take patience, care, and time, but would be worth every moment. The night had grown deeper, shadows stretching across the rooms as the soft glow of lamps painted the familiar surroundings in gentle warmth. The gathering had mostly dispersed, leaving only a few lingering guests chatting quietly. I found myself once again near her, drawn inexplicably, irresistibly, as though her presence was a magnet I couldn't resist. She was standing by the kitchen island, seemingly lost in thought, her fingers lightly tracing the grain of the wood. There was a subtle weight to her posture, a quiet tension that suggested something had unsettled her. Without thinking, I moved closer, silently asking if she wanted company. She looked up, and our eyes met, soft, steady, and knowing. "Long day?" I asked softly, careful to keep my voice low and unobtrusive. She let out a small, almost wry laugh, but there was a fragility in it, a hint of vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "Something like that," she murmured, shoulders lifting slightly as she exhaled. There was a moment of silence between us, heavy but comforting, and it was in that pause that I realized just how much I wanted to offer support, not just words. Without overthinking, I stepped closer, close enough that the warmth of her body brushed against mine. It was subtle, just the gentle pressure of proximity, but it sent an unexpected surge of awareness through me. She didn't step back. Instead, she leaned slightly, a quiet permission in the way she allowed the closeness. "Do you want to sit?" I asked, gesturing toward a nearby chair. She nodded, moving with a graceful, unhurried rhythm as if every movement was deliberate, measured, and meaningful. We settled side by side, close enough that our shoulders touched lightly, and in that small, intimate space the world seemed to shrink. Our conversation began softly, almost cautiously. She shared a memory, perhaps a small regret, a fleeting fear, a story of her day, and I listened intently. Every word, every inflection of her voice seemed to hold weight, resonating with a depth I hadn't expected. I reached out, gently resting my hand near hers, and she allowed it, her fingers brushing mine lightly. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it was deliberate, meaningful, and electric in its simplicity. Her gaze met mine, soft and unguarded, and I felt the quiet surge of connection that had been building over the past days. We didn't rush, we didn't force the moment. I simply offered presence, attention, and warmth. Her hand lingered near mine, her thumb brushing against the back of my hand ever so lightly, and for the first time, the tension between us felt tangible, intimate, and real. In that small space, time seemed suspended. There were no distractions, no expectations, only the quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted, something deeper than curiosity, playful glances, or casual attention. It was a deliberate, mutual recognition of the bond forming between us, trust, care, and the first touch of emotional closeness that carried promise and restraint all at once. That night, I realized our connection had moved beyond fleeting attraction. It had become intentional, patient, and profoundly emotional, a quiet flame glowing steadily, ready to illuminate the path of something far deeper. The night had fully settled, wrapping the house in a soft, peaceful quiet. The last of the guests had departed, leaving only the faint hum of conversation drifting from neighboring rooms. I lingered near the door, my coat half on, hesitant to step out into the crisp evening air. Across the room, she stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of the lamp and the fading city lights beyond. She looked calm, almost ethereal, but there was a quiet vulnerability in her posture that tugged at me. For a moment, we simply watched each other, the room between us filled with unspoken words and shared awareness. Every glance, every slight movement carried meaning. The playful teasing, the subtle touches, the long, quiet pauses, all of it had built to this fragile, delicate tension. It wasn't fraught or heavy. It was warm, steady, and inviting. I stepped closer, careful not to break the fragile intimacy of the moment. "I should probably go," I murmured, though neither of us wanted the evening to end. Her gaze met mine, soft and attentive, and she gave a small, knowing smile. "I know," she said quietly, her voice gentle, almost a whisper. "But I'm glad you stayed this long." The words struck me, carrying layers of meaning beyond their simplicity. I realized then that what we shared, our glances, our quiet moments, the subtle, lingering touches, was not fleeting. It was deliberate, mutual, and profoundly human. I felt a warmth spread through me, a steady reassurance that our connection was real, tender, and worth nurturing. As I reached for my coat, she stepped slightly closer, just enough for her arm to brush lightly against mine. The touch was soft but intentional, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken bond between us. It sent a subtle thrill through me, the kind that comes not from passion, but from recognition, trust, and mutual understanding. "I'll see you again," I said, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. She nodded, her hand brushing briefly against my arm in a gentle, lingering motion that felt like both goodbye and promise at once. "I'd like that," she replied, her eyes holding mine, warm and sincere. There was no need for grand declarations. Everything we had shared was contained in that single, quiet gesture. I lingered for a moment longer, memorizing the curve of her smile, the steady warmth in her gaze, and the subtle confidence she carried even in quiet vulnerability. And then, With one last glance, I stepped into the night, carrying with me the steady pulse of connection, anticipation, and hope. The evening had ended, but the story was far from over. It was a beginning, soft, slow, and deliberate, built on trust, emotional intimacy, and quiet understanding. The tension that had simmered through glances, touches, and shared silences had resolved not in a dramatic revelation, but in something far more enduring, a subtle promise that our paths would cross again, that the connection we had discovered would continue to grow patiently, naturally, and beautifully. As I walked away, the memory of her hand against mine lingered, a quiet warmth that would stay with me long after the night ended. And in that warmth, I understood. Some connections are not rushed. They're savored, nurtured, and allowed to bloom at their own perfect pace.